kind of like, so Tom, we're delighted you're joining us tonight. Thrilled that you're with us. Tell us a little bit about your background. You're an author of several books across several different genres.
Well, I've had the good fortune to be able to write books on almost every subject that I'm interested in. You know, I'm a big baseball fan, so I've had a chance to write several books on baseball, including one that was on the DiMaggio brothers. And for that, I spent a lot of time in Boston with the family of Dominic DiMaggio. I have an interest in golf. I don't play it or don't play it well, but I like writing about it, especially history of it. I've done a couple of books there. Interested in military history, so I've had been very fortunate there. So I really do count my blessings that I've been in a situation in my career that there are topics that I find myself interested in areas I'm interested in, and I've found publishers willing to back me up and say, let's do that. Let's do that book on that topic. That sounds interesting.
That's fabulous. Your publisher for this book, Tombstone, the Earp Brothers, Doc Holliday, and the Vendetta Ride from Hell, St. Martin's Press has been extremely helpful. So thanks to them for helping make arrangements.
They're great. This is I think Tombstone was probably the third book I've done with them. We did the entire Frontier Lawmen trilogy with St. Martin's, and my next two books will also be with St. Martin's. They're a wonderful team to work with.
So now I'm curious. What are the books coming up?
Well, I have a book that's coming up with my frequent collaborator Bob Drury, and he and I, our last book together was Valley Forge, and we have a book coming out. And Carrie, I only thought to send it to you, the cover, like 15 minutes ago. That's what occurred to me. But it's called A Blood and Treasure: Daniel Boone and the Fight for America's Frontier. And it's mostly, everybody thinks they know Daniel Boone. They don't. He did not wear a coonskin cap. No, he did not die at the Alamo. That was Davy Crockett. And a lot of the book takes place in the 1770s, which is a very overlooked part of our history, is how important the Western frontier was to the American Revolution, and how important a part Daniel Boone played in that, which tend to have gotten overlooked in the Fess Parker TV show. So it's a story about the Native Americans who were there, who were finding themselves under siege, the settlers, the crossing of the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky, and that whole first wave into what was considered at that time the first frontier.
Well, that sounds fascinating. So I think we have at least 3 reasons for you to come back. Probably even more than that.
You had me at hello.
Excellent. Yeah, we are so appreciative that you and we've been able to have others join us weekly. Our hope on our end, of course, is that this helps connect authors to audiences and makes people aware of new books that they should be getting. I certainly know it's a challenging time for all, and this isn't quite the same as a book tour, but we're thrilled you're with us.
I'm glad that we have this option. I mean, if I feel a lot of authors have had the thoughts occurred to them that if we had been in this situation 15 years ago when this kind of technology, I don't know if it was available at all, but it probably was in a much more limited way, and much fewer of us knew how to use it.
Yes, indeed.
It's really up a creek.
Indeed. Well, good. So we are just about ready to go, I think. All right. So welcome. I'm Lee Wright, the founder of History Camp. I am near Boston, and with me in Virginia tonight is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund, the director of the Pursuit of History, and we are excited to have with us tonight Tom Clavin, who is the author of Tombstone, the Earp Brothers, Doc Holliday, and the Vendetta Ride from Hell. Thank you so much for joining us, Tom.
Well, thank you. I'm still trying to adjust the light there. I don't want to seem like I'm in a spotlight, but
well, you are in the spotlight, deservedly so.
I might as well. So it's very symbolic, I guess. I might as well accept it.
Indeed. So this is the first opportunity in our series of History Camp Online talks with authors to focus on this era. Would you kind of set the stage, help people understand what was going on in the country, both the East Coast, and the West and the Wild West, so that we've kind of got that common background for our story?
Well, in the aftermath of the Civil War, there really was very much a divide between what was east of the Missouri River and what was west of the Missouri River. In the eastern part of the United States, a lot of cities were gaining in population, especially the waves of immigration that was coming into New York, New Orleans, making their way to Chicago, Boston, of course, and you also had the country celebrating its centennial, which was marked by the Declaration of Independence, which was, something that was an East Coast thing. The whole American Revolution was an East Coast operation, you could say. And then when you get into the 1870s, 1880s, you have a country that is divided. Now, I don't mean that necessarily politically. I'm not trying to make or draw a connection between then and now. But what I mean is, on the eastern part of the Missouri River, there's a lot of turbulence because in 1881, for example, you had the new president, Garfield, who was just shot. And it took him something like 5 months to die from his wound. And so there's a lot of turmoil, uncertainty, all that was going on more on the East Coast and the political upheavals that were going on there. On the western side of the Missouri, it's a different story because you have the frontier is still there. Not for very much longer, actually. I think we have a vision of the Wild West that has lasted for decades. And it really didn't. You really have the Wild West from the end of the Civil War, 1865. By the end of the 1880s, the Wild West is pretty much over. You even had the U.S. Department of the Interior declare the frontier closed by the end of the 1880s. So what's going on there is people trying to settle what they could, when they could, as best they could. And Tombstone, to me, one of the reasons that I became so interested in the topic is beyond the gunfight at the OK Corral. One of the things beyond the gunfight at the OK Corral is Tombstone represented in a lot of ways the end of the frontier days. You had this what was sometimes called manifold destiny, Western migration. Well, it worked its way across the Missouri, across Oklahoma and Texas, across New Mexico. Arizona was pretty much all that was left. If you went any farther west from Arizona, you got to California. Well, that was all settled. That wasn't frontier anymore. So Arizona really represented the last of the frontier, certainly as far as the Southwest was concerned. And more specifically, Tombstone was the last really significant boom town. Boom towns had popped up all over the West for years and years. And Deadwood being one of them in South Dakota, for example. But, excuse me, in Tombstone, there was this enormous silver strike, and that's what made that city spring up overnight, basically, and quickly become a very significant, what it considered itself a sophisticated city. A lot of the citizens call it the San Francisco of the Southwest. But its time, that golden era of Tombstone was really only a few years. Then the mines played out. People started to move away, including the Earp Brothers, for example. And so that what Tombstone represented in the entire history of the 1800s in the United States really intrigued me beyond the familiar stories of the Earp Brothers and the Tombstone and the gunfight at the OK Corral.
Can perhaps get to those couple of others and kind of how everything fits together. But let's go deeper into Tombstone. This is certainly something that's been depicted in popular media, over the decades and so forth. What drew you to the story, and what did you find in your primary research that perhaps corrects or a lot of myths, clears up confusion, and so forth?
Well, as far as getting into the story, there were. I mean, I have to be honest and say there's one very practical motivation, and that is that this is the concluding book in what's called the Frontier Lawmen trilogy. The first book chronologically is Wild Bill, with Hickok being the first, really the epitome of the first post-Civil War lawman. Then you had the second book in the trilogy is Dodge City, where you have Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson taming that town in Kansas, which came to symbolize all the wild cow towns of the West. And then the trilogy needed to be concluded, and Tombstone seemed to be the natural conclusion of that arc from 1865 to 1882 when Tombstone ends. So that's one reason for doing it. And another reason is that I started to find all these other threads to the Tombstone story. One I mentioned before about what it represented in American history, but also the relationship of the brothers. It wasn't just Wyatt and his brother Virgil. There were 5 Earp brothers in Tombstone at the same time. They were a clan of Earps looking to get basically restart their lives again in Tombstone. There were a whole bunch of interesting characters. There was the clash of the Old West and the New West that Tombstone was the epicenter of. And you mentioned about sources. When I was doing research, reading other books about Tombstone, many of these books piggybacked on previous books, which piggybacked on previous books. And some of the earlier books that were the first in the chain, let's say, they were just as often going to print the truth as the legend. In fact, they were more likely to print the legend, or at least not corroborate stories that they included. So that by the time, over the decades, of books on Tombstone, you have a lot of the stories that are being told are absolute myths. Inevitably, some are true, almost by accident, but a lot of the stuff is not true. And this is especially the case when it comes to the depiction of the Tombstone events on the screen. Some people may be familiar with My Darling Clementine, which is one of John Ford's best Westerns, and it is a wonderful Western. It bears very little relationship to what actually happened in Tombstone and the gunfight at the OK Corral. You have the movie called The Gunfight at the OK Corral with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas. And that departs from the truth in a lot of ways, especially the gunfight at the OK Corral, portrayed as this 15-minute long, people running up and down the streets into saloons and shooting at each other behind water barrels and horses. That wasn't true. The gunfight at the OK Corral was 30 shots in 30 seconds. Very fierce firefight, but it was not this long, drawn-out affair. And some of the way characters are portrayed on the screen. I mean, Doc Holliday was a very sick man. He had consumption, tuberculosis. He was. Sometimes you wondered if he was going to be able to get out of bed this morning. Well, who played him in the gunfight at the OK Corral movie? Spartacus. I mean, he's played by Kirk Douglas. So what I wanted to do was go back and go sift through contemporary sources. I mean, thankfully, in Tombstone at that time, there were not one but 2 newspapers, and the Tombstone Nugget and the Tombstone Epitaph. And they were reporting on events as they were happening. Now, I'm not saying these were Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists by any means, but they were still reporting what they saw, what they experienced, what was happening. Another thing is a more recent discovery is that it was found in the bowels of the Tombstone Courthouse Museum transcripts of the trial. Most books and most movies that deal with the gunfight at the OK Corral, when the gunfight is over, the story is over. Certainly in the movies, gunfight's over, cue the music, show the credits, movie's over. But what's not known is that there was a rather dramatic courtroom inquisition, you could call it. It wasn't exactly technically a trial, but Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday were basically on trial for murder, and this lasted for a month. And a lot of these transcripts were not available to a lot of previous writers. So to be able to go through these transcripts and see what the Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, marshals, sheriffs, eyewitnesses, Ike Clanton, other, the surviving participant in the OK Corral fight from the other side, to see what they were actually saying, what they actually described, was really very, very helpful. So, I'm not saying anything brilliant to people, in your audience who really enjoy history and care about it. But many times you go back to as contemporary sources as you can find, because that's if they're reporting something as it happened, they're not always going to be completely correct, but you don't have decades of embellishments and exaggerations and fictions piled on top of it.
One in a series of events in a frontier town.
I don't think I heard the beginning of that question.
Sorry, I was just saying, how was it depicted in the newspaper? Was it essentially, I mean, was it a really big event, or was it simply, these things happen, it's a frontier town, gunfights happen?
Well, that's another aspect that made it really interesting to me, is that these things did not happen at that time, and even in frontier towns, because by 1881, October 1881 is when the gunfight took place. I should say many of the frontier towns, they had pretty established systems of law and order. They had sheriffs in the towns and cities. They had marshals who were marshals of the cities, sheriffs of the counties. You had federal marshals, deputy marshals. You had court systems. They were still rudimentary in a lot of ways, some of them, but it was by this time highly unusual to have these kind of shootouts that reenactments would have you think are happening every day, and that was particularly true of Tombstone. You go back a decade to Dodge City, where there was violence was happening frequently. That was the way the frontier was at that time in the mid 1870s. That's the challenge Wyatt, Earp, and Bat Masterson faced as deputy marshal and as the sheriff. Masterson was the sheriff of Ford County. But by Tombstone in the fall of 1881, it was unusual to have an outbreak of violence. So the citizenry were very shocked that there was this sudden explosion of violence. There had been a lot of tension in Tombstone because of the friction between the cowboys representing the Wild West and the Old West, and the Earps, who very reluctantly were representing the New West and trying to make Tombstone a peaceful place to live. So there was that tension there. But even so, I don't think, maybe only a handful of people would have predicted that there would have come this time where these 8 men, 4 against 4, squared off against each other, and this very brutal explosion of violence. Like I said, 30 shots in 30 seconds. It wasn't in the OK Corral itself. It was in an alleyway that was only 15 feet wide. It's a miracle anybody survived.
People know about the shootout, but your book continues, the Vendetta Ride from Hell, which I would certainly make colorful text on a movie poster, but I don't think it's ever made the movies.
Let me put it this way: there is, in the movie Tombstone, with Kurt Russell playing Wyatt Earp and Sam Elliott as Virgil Earp, there is a line in the movie which is only from the movie. I mean, the screenwriter invented that line, where you have the Kurt Russell as Wyatt Earp say, "Tell him I'm coming and I'm bringing hell with me." So, as far as the movie's concerned, that line was used, and it was a rather brief and not completely accurate depiction of the Vendetta Ride. So another reason why I thought of doing something a little bit different with Tombstone is that I don't want to make it seem like I'm the only one who's ever covered the Vendetta Ride. There's a writer named Jeff Gwynne who's a terrific writer, and he did a book in 2012 called The Last Gunfight, and he does also deal with that. So I don't want to make it seem like I invented the depiction of the Vendetta Ride. But I wanted to go into it in some more detail because it was really the Vendetta Ride, more so than his tenure as a lawman in Dodge City. And you could say even more so than the gunfight at the OK Corral, it's the Vendetta Ride that made Wyatt Earp a legend. Here he was with 2 brothers, one crippled for life, the other one dead. And he's got one brother left, Warren, the youngest Earp brother, and his loyal companion, Doc Holliday. And they're finally sick of being picked upon, being preyed upon. So they saddle up and they go to hunt down the guys who shot his brothers. And they're mostly successful, not completely. There are a couple of people who got away, but there are others that Wyatt took the law in his own hands, and that was not Wyatt Earp's way. Wyatt Earp was not by nature a vigilante, and not by nature a violent man. There's some question about that he killed somebody, a cowboy, in his Dodge City days, but there's no doubt he killed people in a cold-blooded way on this Vendetta Ride. So it's kind of that Wyatt Earp is the legend that many people think about when they think about Wyatt Earp, not the more peaceful man who was just trying to find a business that he can make some money
in. Give us the background to the gunfight, and then what brought it about in that alley.
The gunfight was the crescendo, let's say, of the tension that had been going on all year between the corrupt ranchers and the cowboys who worked for them, and went beyond working for corrupt ranchers. They were vigilantes. I mean, Curly Bill Brocius, Johnny Ringo, they were the leaders of the cowboy faction that basically did not want the New West to keep moving forward. They liked it where you had fewer laws, fewer retributions for violent behavior, that they could shoot somebody and get away with it. On Saturday nights, they could get drunk and shoot up the town, which is depicted in a lot of movies. And so they did not want the law to tell them what to do and to be arresting them and putting them on trial. And if there had been an more effective law and order system in Tombstone, the Earps might not have ever been involved. There was a sheriff of the county there, Cochise County, where Tombstone was in, Johnny Behan, who was basically in league with the cowboys, or at best, to give him some credit, he just didn't want to be the enforcement guy. He just, he kept trying to make nice with everybody, and that didn't work. The cowboys could brush him aside and do what they wanted. So Virgil Earp became the marshal of Tombstone, and his brothers were deputized when Virgil needed help. He needed a couple of wingmen. It was his brothers Wyatt and Morgan who he turned to, because these are the people on the planet that he could trust the most. And the particular day of the gunfight at the OK Corral, the night Ike Clanton and his brother Billy and Frank McLaury and his brother Tom McLaury were good friends. They were ranchers, and Ike had been in town in Tombstone the night before, very drunk, not unusual for Ike, making all kinds of threats about how it was time to kill the Earps. The Earps became, reluctantly and inadvertently, the face of law and order in Tombstone. They didn't want the job. But Virgil was the marshal. Wyatt had a reputation for being a very effective lawman in Dodge City. He and Morgan had been deputized several times to do posses and things like that. So the focus of the cowboys' anger and the ranchers' anger, who was stopping them from doing whatever they wanted, became the Earp Brothers. And so the day of the OK Corral gunfight is that the McLaurys and the Clantons were wearing guns, which you could not do in the city limit of Tombstone, and they were just meandering around. They couldn't make up their minds, basically. They were not in town with the intention necessarily that they wanted to start a gunfight. Maybe Ike, what his drunken threats was, but they were not sure what to do. If they had gotten on their horses and left, there would have been no problem. Or if they had stayed in town but left the guns, behind a saloon bar or something like that, no problem. Instead, indecisively, they were wandering around, and finally, the town fathers, so to speak, is an old-fashioned expression, of course, but they said to Virgil, well, listen, you're the marshal. We can't let this go on all day. It looks bad for us that you're not doing anything, so go do something. Disarm them. So Virgil, yes, okay, that's my job. So he deputizes Wyatt and Morgan, and they get their guns ready. And just as they're about to march down the street towards where the four men are, by this point, waiting for them, they hear the Earps are on their way. Doc Holliday appears, And Doc was, the only friend he had was Wyatt. Nobody else liked Doc, often for good reason. Doc was very hurt that they would go into this battle, what they thought would be a battle, and they would leave Doc out of it. So it's almost like an amusing scene in the book, but it's like, oh, okay, Doc, we'll make you a deputy too. Like they're dealing with a middle schooler. And so Virgil reluctantly deputized him. The last man you want wearing a badge is Doc Holliday. And the other amusing thing is Virgil hands Doc a shotgun. In movies, Doc is depicted as quite the gunfighter and marksman. Doc had a hard time hitting anything with a pistol. He was in all kinds of gunfights where nobody got hurt because he couldn't hit anybody and the other person couldn't hit anybody either. So that's why Virgil hands him a shotgun, because he figures if they're in close quarters with a shotgun, even Doc's got to hit something. So that's when this march began down the street to where the McLowrys and the Clantons were waiting. And it happened to be in this alley where they all encountered each other. And even when they were encountering each other, Ike and Billy Clanton, Frank and Tom McLowry on one side, Virgil, Wyatt, Morgan, Earp, and Doc Holliday on the other. Virgil was saying to them, just take off your guns. Just drop them there. You guys, I'll keep them for you. You guys go home, come back, get them tomorrow. And then something happened, and there's no definitive word or evidence as to what exactly happened. What seems to have happened is that Doc may have been pulling back the hammers of the shotgun because things were getting tense. Anything could happen at any moment. And it might have been Doc pulling back the hammers of the shotgun that made the McLowrys react and the Clantons react. And Billy Clanton, Frank, and Tom McLowry opened fire. And as soon as they started shooting, the Earps opened fire. And Doc started shooting. And it's like I said, 30 shots in 30 seconds. And at the end of those 30 seconds, this alley is filled with gun smoke, as you can imagine. There are 3 men dead and 3 men wounded. Wyatt was the only one to not be wounded or killed, even though he's right there. It wasn't like he hid behind anything. He was right in the open. And just bullets missed him. And Ike Clanton, at the first gunshots, ran for his life. The one who had instigated this fight basically was the first one to take off. And so you can understand, I think, with the reality being 30 shots in 30 seconds, why a lot of filmmakers would not want to depict the gunfight as it actually happened, because you just spent perhaps 90 or 95 minutes leading up to the gunfight that's over in 30 seconds. You're going to have the audience going, that's it? But that's what actually happened.
Any sense? Sorry, do you have any sense of how far apart the men were in the alleyway, one side versus the other?
Well, it was only 15 feet wide. So they were only about 8 to 10 feet away from each other, assuming they weren't up against the opposite buildings.
Yeah.
So, that the one of the things that was very helpful about the transcripts is that you have people, eyewitnesses, describing what happened. However, one of the drawbacks to something like that is making sure you put together what several people have said that corroborate each other and are consistent. It's sort of like when somebody hits a home run to win the World Series. In the years following, there must have been 300,000 people in that stadium. For all the ones who say they were right there when they saw so-and-so hit the home run that won the World Series. So you had these people coming out of the woodwork saying that they watched everything that happened in the gunfight. They may not have been within 100 yards of it.
At what point, what was the path from this event, which you've explained was not common anymore, to this becoming kind of this legendary event?
That's a good question. I think it would have been a well-known event, certainly in the Southwest. And there were headlines back in the East Coast about this big shootout. in Tombstone. It would have been a well-known event, and I think two things happened. One was rather immediate. Well, I shouldn't say immediate. The gunfight at the OK Corral was October 26, 1881, and the Earp Vendetta Ride was not really until the following March, in the immediate aftermath of Morgan Earp getting ambushed and killed. So it was that Vendetta Ride and the death toll from that, and how that made headlines all over Arizona and the Southwest, that watch out, Wyatt Earp's coming for you, that I think enhanced the impact of the gunfight as a very special event. But what also happened too is that as getting into the 20th century, as there were frontier towns that had been frontier towns, were looking for ways to attract business, they started to do reenactments. They started to, understandably, try and do more with their history. I don't mean that in any way, shape, or form as a criticism, but Tombstone, which the mines had closed for years, and Tombstone had gone for many, many years as a town in economic retreat. But they did have that happen in their town, and so as they began to do these reenactments of those events, it started to become more of a famous event because they enhanced it. So I think that was a big part of it. I think when you had, especially the movies, seized on it. In 1932, there was a book that came out called Frontier Marshal, Wyatt Earp Frontier Marshal, which was the first biography of Wyatt Earp. A lot of it's embellished and exaggerated, and some of it's just simply made up. But that was turned into a movie with Walter Houston playing the Wyatt Earp character. And then you had other films that started to portray Wild West famous figures. Certainly in the Plains with Gary Cooper, you had Wild Bill Hickok, and also Buffalo Bill was in there. So as the decades went on, and the Westerns were making more and more, doing more and more portrayals of well-known figures, the gunfight at the OK Corral acquired this very mythical status in our history, and but it had to be embellished. Like I said, you can't portray it the way it truly was, because to some people they might find it anticlimactic that it was over in 30 seconds.
About the vendetta, but before we do that, in terms of the gunfight itself, other than the length of time, it being only 30 seconds, what are some of the things that you came across that were surprising to you, or you think that they really deserve to be better known, perhaps clarifying some of the myths?
Well, one of the things that struck me is, again, how the movie depictions diverted from the reality. I mean, in My Darling Clementine, John Ford claimed that the story of the OK Corral he showed in his movie he got from Wyatt Earp himself. So if that's true, then Earp was probably quite elderly then and not remembering things too well. I suspect it's more John Ford's blarney, because in the movie you have Virgil Earp dying before the gunfight even takes place. You have Doc Holliday dying during the gunfight. Same thing with the gunfight at the OK Corral. You have Burt Lancaster chasing Billy Clanton through the streets of Tombstone, which didn't happen. So the depiction was remarkable to me. But I think that another thing that struck me about the actual gunfight is these fellas really showed a lot of courage. Now, you could say foolhardiness to be in an alley and draw their guns and fire at each other at such close range. But given that gunfights were almost non-existent by that time, to stand there and stare at each other and know at any moment you could die. I mean, obviously millions of other people face that situation in war, for example, but unfortunately it happened because 3 men died and 3 others were wounded, 2 of them quite seriously. But I found it, really suspenseful and an act of courage that they went ahead and did this. and none of them, except for Ike Clanton, took off. None of the other ones backed down, and because they weren't gonna give in. None of them was going to show any cowardice at that point, even though they knew that within seconds any one of them could have been dead.
Now the event happens. The trial took place when, and then the vendetta was in the Springs. Is that correct? The Vendetta Ride.
Yes, the trial took place immediately. The gunfight was almost immediately. The gunfight was October 26th, and I think it was the 31st or November 1st. The trial began, and it lasted for 30 days. And it was not until the very last day of November that the judge handed down his decision. And so it was really rather dramatic. A lot of the testimony and the stakes were very high, because if the judge had decided that Wyatt and Doc should be sent off to Tombstone to be tried for murder, and if they had been found guilty, they could have been in prison for the rest of their lives, and we might never have heard of them or heard very little about them, or they could have been hung been executed for murder. So so that was over. And I think what also interested me about the story is that when the trial was over, the Inquisition, I guess it would be inquest, a better way to put it, was over. Everybody in Tombstone breathed this sigh of relief and say, okay, we're done with that. We got the gunfight is over. The inquest is over. We can end of the story. Let's move on with our lives and, look forward to being that more civilized community we've been aspiring to be, that San Francisco of the Southwest. But then there were events afterwards that surprised everybody, because you had cowboys that felt betrayed by the justice system. They were upset that there was nobody going to jail, or worse, based on the McLaurys and Billy Clanton all dying in that gunfight. So in December, they bushwhacked Virgil Earp when he was making his rounds, and they almost killed him. He did, but he was crippled for the rest of his life. And even then, the Earp was sort of like, okay, enough's enough. We got ours, you got yours. But it was on, I think, the 18th of March, 1882, when Wyatt and Morgan were playing, shooting pool in Tombstone. And again, there was this ambush, and Morgan Earp was shot in the back and died on the pool table. And that was when, Doc Holliday came running, and that was when Wyatt and Doc, as I describe in the book, they looked at each other. That glance that they exchanged was saying, that's enough, we're going after them now. And then almost immediately was when they got a posse together of their own picking, including Warren Earp, and they went off to chase these guys down.
Another question, and then we'll get to questions from people who are watching. But give us a sense of what was involved in that ride. It was over what distance, how much time, and so forth. I guess I'm thinking of some of the the popular TV shows and so forth. We see the vast expanses. I kind of wonder how do you find anybody out there, even if you're looking intently and so forth. So give us a sense of how that took place.
Well, Wyatt and Doc and Warren and 3 or 4 of their colleagues or friends who rode with them, they took off, and they're they people that went along. You see so and so, you see so and so. They knew who they were looking for, so they eventually tracked down. Well, in the case of one of them, one of the guys had actually arrived at a train station where they were putting Morgan's body on a train and taking him to the Earp family farm, and tried to assassinate the other person. And Wyatt killed him. That was number one. And in fact, as Virgil, who was accompanying the casket because he's very badly wounded, Wyatt looks in the train window as it's leaving, and he holds a finger up. That's one. That's the first one. And they tracked down a couple more, and also part of this was a ambush that Curly Bill Brocius engineered with a whole bunch of cowboys against Wyatt's posse. And it was during this ambush that Wyatt, again, unscathed, bullets flying all around him, going through his coat and things like that. He, with a shotgun, killed Curly Bill Brocius. So you had several victims of the Vendetta Ride. There was almost a Keystone Cops aspect to it, because after Wyatt and Doc and that posse left Tombstone, Sheriff Johnny Behan was basically told, well, listen, you're the sheriff. This is an illegal posse. It really actually wasn't, because Wyatt, by this point, had been appointed as deputy U.S. Marshal. Go get them. So Johnny Behan puts his own posse together to go after and capture the first posse. And then the sheriff of Arizona, puts together a third posse to go after what he thinks is the illegal Johnny Behan posse. So you had these three posses who were roaming all over southeast of Arizona, circling each other, trying to catch up with each other. And there is a scene that actually opens and closes the book, where Wyatt Earp and his posse are at a ranch. They know that Johnny Behan, they've got 7 or 8 guys in Wyatt's posse. They know that Johnny Behan and 25 guys are on their trail and getting closer. And they leave this ranch to go into the hills to occupy some high territory, high terrain, because strategically you're in a better defensive position. And they basically say to Johnny Behan, "Come, we're waiting for you. Let's finish this right now." So that's a very pivotal part of the book. I don't want to give away how it ends, because that also is the conclusion of the book. But you're not wrong when you say you remember these depictions in films of, like, The Searchers, for example, people riding over these vast expanses. Arizona is pretty flat, and they covered a lot of territory in a short amount of time, all trying to look for each other and hunt each other down.
Okay, this is great. We have some great questions coming in, so let's get a start on those. Donovan is asking, who do you think killed Johnny Ringo?
The weight of evidence that in the research I did supports the idea that Johnny Ringo committed suicide. I know that sounds like kind of a cop-out, but there were many stories that Wyatt Earp killed Johnny Ringo, although Wyatt was in Colorado at the time. There were stories, and it's certainly depicted this way in the movie Tombstone, that Doc Holliday challenged Johnny, because they hated each other anyway, and that he challenged Johnny Ringo, and they had this duel in which Doc Holliday killed Johnny Ringo. But the evidence suggests that Doc Holliday, who was also in Colorado with Wyatt, would have been unable to make that kind of trip back in a fairly short period of time, because there's other evidence of people seeing him in Colorado. Johnny Ringo is a fascinating character. I try and give him as much time as I can in the book. He was a sociopath in a lot of ways, but he also was he was a charismatic, charming guy too. He also suffered from manic depression, and the book goes into reasons for that. Well, certainly wasn't diagnosed with that at the time, but Johnny Ringo is kind of almost poignant that he was realizing he had a very bad drinking problem and depression, and that's a bad combination, and a handgun, that's a bad combination too. And the West that he knew, that he ruled as the head of the cowboy faction, was passing him by. He was becoming obsolete. So it does seem to be the case that he was up in the hills by himself, and he took off his boots and he leaned against a tree and he shot himself.
Okay. Chris would like to know if you have any information that you can share about the families during the aftermath of the shootout. What did the wives do to protect their families?
The Earps, to me, an important part of the book is, as I mentioned, the clannish Earps. They had 5 Earp brothers, 4 of whom were married. And when I say married, I have to use that term loosely, because at that time, I think only one of the 4 brothers who was married had actually gone through a ceremony. And in fact, Wyatt was transitioning from wife number 3 to wife number 4 while in Tombstone. But they formed this kind of compound that of men and their wives to support each other, protect each other, initially to become successful businessmen together. But then it was more like a protection kind of thing. Now, the wives, mostly, they did not themselves wear guns or go out to protect. In fact, they were mostly told, stay out of downtown Tombstone. One reason was as a protection measure, because as things got more tense, you never knew if somebody was going to be crazy enough to take out their frustrations or their anger on one of the Earp wives. Another reason is that polite society at Tombstone looked down at the Earp wives because they were viewed as little more than prostitutes. So, because at least three of them did not have, or not officially wives, they had been, as far as we know, no wedding ceremonies. So, after the gunfight at the OK Corral, Virgil, and after Virgil was crippled, like I said, he and his wife Allie went back to the family farm. Morgan's wife Louisa, she went back to live with her family, and Wyatt had been with his wife number 3, but in Tombstone he fell in love with wife number 4, Josephine Marcus, and eventually, once the Vendetta Ride was over, he went to San Francisco, where he had sent her to protect her, and he collected Josephine, and they were together for the next 45 years.
Okay. Grayson would like to know, why is it called the battle at the OK Corral if it took place in an alleyway?
Well, as part of the 2 reasons. One, as part of the wanderings that the McLowrys and the clans did, they passed the OK Corral, and at least one of them had a horse stable there. So there is some connection to the OK Corral. They passed through it. Another reason is that, and again, I don't mean this as a criticism, it's just a very practical solution. When they started doing reenactments, especially as reenactments became more popular, you couldn't fit many people paying customers into a 15-foot wide alley. So move it to the OK Corral and call it the gunfight at the OK Corral, because you could put up bleachers kind of facilities there, and people could be standing on the fences of the corral. It just made for a better reenactment experience than a small alley.
Fair enough. All right. Christy is asking, do you think the ambushes were due to the Earp brothers being something like trophies for someone?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't been asked that one before. I think, first of all, after the OK Corral, the Earps were, target number 1 for vengeance, for revenge, because you did have 2 ranchers, popular ranchers, even though they were kind of crooks. The McLowry brothers were rather popular, and you had Billy Clan, Ike's younger brother, all of whom were shot to death. So there was, among the cowboys and rancher colleagues, there was definitely a thirst for revenge. And who best to get your revenge on but the Earp brothers, who actually were pulling the triggers in this gunfight. But I think, yes, as far as the ambushes were concerned, the one against Virgil in December, the one against Morgan in March, I think what better way, since the Earp brothers had very reluctantly become the de facto representatives of law and order in Tombstone, what better way to upend that law and order, to strike a blow against the law and order system becoming more entrenched, and to show the cowboys still rule the roost, than to ambush Earp brothers. After Virgil was ambushed, Morgan was ambushed, there's no doubt that Wyatt would have been next. So going on this Vendetta Ride with Doc was also a bit of a proactive, act. I better get you before, rather than just sit around and get me. I mean, that's basically, Virgil and Morgan were both shot because the Earps kind of let their guard down, and Wyatt was not going to let that happen anymore.
Okay. And Perry would like to know what happened to Wyatt after the Vendetta Ride.
Wyatt had a long life, and that's one of the reasons why I think he also became a legendary figure, is that, he was around for many years afterwards to occasionally be interviewed. Somebody like Wild Bill Hickok was dead, I think, at 36 or 37. Doc Holliday was dead at 36. Batman left the West and spent the rest of his life as a newspaper reporter in New York City. Wyatt lived until his 2 months before his 81st birthday, and it was a wandering life. He was very restless, and thankfully, with wife number 4, Josephine, he found a partner and wanted to wander just as much as he did. So they wandered throughout Colorado, California. He operated a saloon in Alaska, back to California. He sold real estate in San Diego for a few years. He spent his last years living in Los Angeles as a consultant to in the motion picture industry, silent westerns, Tom Mix, people like that making pictures. They consulted. He got paid to be a consultant, and somebody he took under his wing was a young director of silent westerns named John Ford in the 1920s. And so when Wyatt died in January of 1929, that's what he was doing. And thankfully for him, it was not a very long illness, and pretty amazing when you think about it. Not only the adventures he had, the tough scripts that he had, but the life expectancy of that time, that he lived until he was almost 81 years old.
That is impressive. That is impressive, definitely. Okay, we are about out of time. We've got a couple more questions that we can try to get through quickly here. Perry corrected me. He said he wanted to know about Warren after the Vendetta Ride. So I misread that.
Warren, sadly, was always like the runt of the litter. And he was always getting into trouble, and he also had a serious drinking problem. And eventually, he tried different jobs, including being a frontier, Western detective, which he wasn't very good at because he couldn't find anything. And he eventually died in a shootout. I think it was around 1900, 1901, where he died confronting anybody. And sadly, his body was back, and he was buried on the family farm.
Okay, thank you. And Chris would like a little more detail about the wives in particular protecting their families. Chris, I'm not sure if you're referring to the wives of the Earp Brothers and Doc Holliday, what was happening with them specifically as the shootout was happening, perhaps?
Well, again, they were part of the Earp compound. And I should mention that Doc, again, he had a woman who was not his wife, but his companion, a big-nosed Kate Elder. She was probably not in Tombstone at the time of the shootout. The wives heard about the shooting, but they did not get there until it was over. They ran down there. And you mentioned the word families. And I think what's also interesting is that none of the Earp brothers had children. James Earp, the older of the bunch there in Tombstone, he had 2 stepchildren because he married a woman who had 2 children, and he adopted them. Wyatt and his first wife was pregnant, but she died when she was 8 months pregnant, and the baby died with her, probably of cholera. But the wives were the families. There was no Earp children to protect, which is kind of interesting. I mean, you have 5 brothers, and there was no natural child from any of them. I say biological child.
That is interesting. All right. Well, this has been just great. And this was a great read for me. I will tell you, you kind of threw a wet blanket on my idea of cowboys when I read this book. We kind of have the romanticized view like we do with pirates, when we get this from Louis L'Amour and Hollywood and so forth. It turns out they weren't the nicest guys. So there's lots.
You're in Dodge City or Tombstone. See a few reenactments. You'll be back where you were.
Yeah, perfect. All right. So tell me again the name of the book that's coming out next for you and when that is going to be published.
The next book, which I'm doing with my co-author, Bob Drury, we did the book Valley Forge together, is called Blood and Treasure, Daniel Boone and the Fight for America's First Frontier. And it's going to be out next April. And certainly we've got our fingers crossed that circumstances will allow us to tour for the book, to actually go back to seeing people up close and shake their hands and personally inscribe books for them. I missed that terribly this year, and I really hope next year is different, to be with people again and readers.
Absolutely. We understand that for sure. We have missed being together with all of our people at our in-person events too. Definitely. Well, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fantastic. We have put a link in the comments so you can check out Tom's book, and I would highly recommend you do that. It's a fun read, and there's so much more in there than we were even able to cover tonight. So check that out. And then next week, we will have Stephen Freed with us, and he is going to be talking about one of our lesser known founding fathers, Dr. Benjamin Rush. So we will see you then. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.